We all know the stories. The grand fleets, the heroic last stands, the speeches that make you want to punch a hole through a bulkhead. Forget all that. This isn't a story about the best of humanity. It's about the leftovers, the ones they don't put on recruitment posters, the ones with court-martials in their file and debt collectors on their comms. And the worst of them? The one they had to send. Her name is Captain Ilera Venn, and she's taking a jury-rigged museum piece farther than any human has ever gone. No support, no backup, no hope, really. But here's the thing about humans they never put in the textbooks. We don't need hope. We have duct tape, spite, and a woman who's already dead inside. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Strap in. The distress call was 200 years old. Captain Ilera Venn knew this before she even opened her eyes. The chronometer stamp was the first thing her brain processed, even before the fog of cryo-sleep fully lifted. 2 centuries. Give or take a decade. That meant the people who sent it were either dead, evolved into something unrecognizable, or had become ghosts so old they'd forgotten they were ever alive. She lay in the suspension pod, listening to the fluids drain with a soft, sucking sigh. The air in the cabin smelled of recycled metal and her own stale sweat. Standard. Captain, said the ship's AI, a voice she'd named Sour because it always sounded vaguely disappointed. We have arrived at the threshold of the Formicide expanse. The distress signal originates from a point approximately 14 light-years beyond the charted boundary. Ilera didn't move. She stared at the ceiling of the pod, where a single hairline crack in the ceramic tile caught the amber emergency light. She'd noticed that crack 3 years ago on a shakedown cruise that wasn't a shakedown cruise. It was the day they told her this was a one-way trip. Any other traffic in the sector? She asked. Her voice was a dry rasp. None, Captain. By design. By design. Of course. The Commonwealth didn't send rescue fleets to the edge of nowhere. They sent one ship, one captain, one crew of misfits and malcontents who'd drawn the shortest possible straw. If they succeeded, the Commonwealth took credit. If they failed, the Commonwealth never mentioned them again. Neat. Clean. Efficient. She sat up. The pod creaked. Everything on this ship creaked. The last left turn, they'd nicknamed her, because every decision you made out here was probably the wrong one. The cabin was small, barely larger than a walk-in closet. 4 other pods lined the opposite wall. 3 were open, their occupants already gone. The 4th was still sealed, frost clinging to the viewport. Ilera swung her legs over the side of her pod and sat for a moment, barefoot on the cold deck. She rubbed her face with both hands. Her reflection in the dark screen of the NAV terminal showed a woman of 43 who looked 55, gray streaking her dark hair, deep lines around her mouth, eyes that had stopped being surprised a long time ago. She stood, pulled on her jumpsuit, zipped it halfway, didn't bother with the boots. The corridor beyond was narrow and badly lit. The LTL was a retired scout vessel, decommissioned twice, stripped of its weapons, and then hastily retrofitted with a long-range distortion drive that had a 30% failure rate. The engineering corps had called it experimental. Ilera called it a suicide button. She found the rest of her crew in the mess hall. Leo Ng was at the table, dismantling a coffee dispenser with the methodical precision of a bomb tech. He was 26, with quick hands and a slower smile, and he'd been a gifted engineer until he'd publicly accused his commanding officer of falsifying maintenance logs. He'd been right. He'd also been court-martialed. Now he was here. Morning, Captain, he said without looking up. Coffee machine's dead. I'm trying to convince it to be reborn. Let me know if you need last rites. He grinned. It was a good grin. Ilera tried not to feel guilty about the fact that she was probably leading him to his death. Across the room, by the viewport, stood Miri Okonkwo. She was older than Ilera by 2 years, but she moved like a woman half her age. Taut, watchful. Her background was xenolinguistics and first contact diplomacy, a field that required nerves of steel and the patience of a glacier. She'd been exiled after refusing to translate a trade agreement that would have stripped a newly contacted species of their primary water source. The Commonwealth called it insubordination. Miri called it Tuesday. Signals degrading, Miri said, not turning around. Whoever sent, it is using a very old encryption protocol. Pre-Commonwealth. Maybe pre-unification. Can you decode it? I can try. But the language base is odd. It's not any of the standard Xeno tongues. It might be a derivative. Or it might be something new. Alara walked to the viewport. Outside, the stars had changed. They were no longer the familiar clusters of Commonwealth space. These stars were sparse, cold, scattered like ash across black velvet. The Formicide expanse, named for the ant-like aliens who'd once claimed this region, before they'd vanished 10,000 years ago, leaving behind only ruins and warnings that no one had ever fully translated. Any sign of the source? Alara asked. Weak, Leo said, finally, coaxing a sputter of brown liquid from the dispenser. But consistent. It's a beacon. A distress beacon. Someone out there wants to be found very badly. Or wants to lure someone in very badly. Leo's grin faded. He poured a cup of the brown liquid, sniffed it, and made a face. Yeah, there's that too. The fourth crew member was still in cryo. Alara walked back to the cabin and stood in front of the sealed pod. Through the frosted glass, she could see a face. Young. Male. Early 20s. His name was Darian Voss, and he was their pilot. He was also a convicted hacker who'd broken into the Commonwealth's Central Census database to erase his sister's debt records. He'd succeeded. He'd also been caught. The Commonwealth had offered him a choice: a military prison for 20 years, or this mission with a full pardon upon completion. He'd chosen wrong, Alara thought. But then again, so had all of them. She pressed the release. The pod hissed open. Darian gasped awake, eyes wide, hands instinctively reaching for restraints that weren't there. He coughed, shivered. Then his gaze found Alara's face, and something in him relaxed. Not trust, just recognition. We there, he mumbled. We're at the edge, Alara said. The signal's coming from deeper in. 14 light years past the boundary. Darian sat up slowly, rubbing his arms. 14 years in normal space. Or 2 weeks if the distortion drive doesn't tear us apart. He looked at her. Really looked. She saw him catalog the gray in her hair, the exhaustion she couldn't hide, the way she held her left arm, slightly stiff. An old injury from a docking accident that had never healed right. You think it's real? He asked. The distress call? I think it's old. I think it's desperate. And I think we're the only ones coming. He nodded slowly. Then he swung his legs over the side of the pod and stood. He was taller than her, but he moved with a careful humility, as if trying to take up less space. Okay, he said. Let's go see what's trying to kill us. They gathered in the cockpit, a cramped space with 3 seats, a dozen flickering displays, and a viewport that was more patch than glass. Sauer's voice filled the room like an unwanted guest. Distortion drive is nominal. Jump window in 47 minutes. Recommend finalizing course parameters. Alara strapped into the command chair. Miri took the seat to her right, data slate in hand. Darian slid into the pilot's station, his fingers already dancing across the controls, recalibrating things that Leo had already calibrated. Leo himself leaned against the bulkhead, coffee in hand, watching. Play the signal again, Alara said. Miri tapped her slate. The cabin filled with sound. It was thin, reedy. A voice. No, voices, layered on top of each other, speaking in a language that rose and fell like waves on a strange shore. There were no words Alara recognized, no patterns that matched the xenolinguistic databases. But the feeling was unmistakable. Fear, exhaustion, a plea. Then, at the very end, something changed. A single phrase repeated 3 times in broken but clear Commonwealth standard. Not alone. Not alone. Not alone. Silence. Darian turned in his seat. His face was pale. That's not a translation artifact. Someone taught them that phrase. Someone human. Miri nodded slowly. The signal is 200 years old. The first deep space exploration missions went out about 230 years ago. It's possible, theoretically possible, that one of those early ships went off course, crashed here, and made contact with something. And then what? Leo asked. They taught the locals how to say not alone. That's not a distress call. That's a message. Alara stared at the viewport. Outside, the stars waited. Cold. Indifferent. Or a warning, she said quietly. The jump was not smooth. Alara had made distortion jumps before, dozens of them, during her early career as a scout pilot. They always felt wrong, like being turned inside out and then hastily reassembled. But this one was worse. The LTL shook like a dying animal. Alarms blared. Leo shouted something about harmonic resonance. Darian fought the controls, sweat dripping down his face. Miri gripped her seat so hard her knuckles went white. And Elara closed her eyes and counted. 1, 2, 3. She thought about the last time she'd seen Earth. The green hills, the rain on her face, the way her mother had hugged her at the spaceport, holding on too long, like she knew. 4, 5, 6. She thought about the mission briefing. The admiral who'd looked at her like she was already dead. The words, "You are expendable, Captain, but your mission is not. Find the source of the signal. Determine if it poses a threat to the Commonwealth. Report back if you can." 7, 8, 9. She thought about the name of her ship. The last left turn. The joke among scouts was that the last left turn was the one you took when you'd already made every possible mistake. There was no right turn after that. Just a void. 10. The shaking stopped. Silence. Elara opened her eyes. The viewport showed a star system. Yellow sun. For planets. The third one was blue-green, streaked with white clouds. It looked like home. It looked like a trap. Darien let out a breath he'd been holding for a very long time. We're here. 14 light years past the boundary. Distortion drive is actually it's fine. That was smoother than the simulation. It wasn't smooth, Leo said flatly. The harmonic damper is shot. We're not making another jump until I replace it. How long? A day. Maybe 2. Elara nodded. She wasn't surprised. Nothing on this ship worked the way it was supposed to. That was the point. The Commonwealth had given them just enough rope to hang themselves. Miri, she said. The signal. Where's it coming from? Miri's fingers flew across her slate. The third planet. Surface. There's a structure. Large. Artificial. I'm picking up energy signatures. Low level. Maybe geothermal. Maybe something else. Life signs. A long pause. Miri's brow furrowed. That's the strange part. I'm getting thousands of them. But they're faint. Like they're not fully there. Or like they're hiding. Elara looked at the blue-green planet. So beautiful. So inviting. So wrong. Darien, she said. Take us down. Slow approach. And keep the comms open. He nodded and began the descent. The atmosphere was breathable. That was the first surprise. Elara had expected toxins, thin air, something hostile. But the sensors showed a mix of nitrogen and oxygen, almost identical to Earth. The temperature was mild. The gravity was a hair lighter, but nothing a human couldn't adapt to. The second surprise was the silence. No animal calls. No wind. No sound at all except the soft hum of the ship's systems and the crunch of their boots on the ground. They'd landed in a clearing, surrounded by a forest of tall, pale trees with leaves that shimmered silver in the light of the yellow sun. The ground was covered in a soft, moss-like substance that seemed to absorb sound. Every step felt muffled. Every breath felt loud. I don't like this, Leo muttered, his hand resting on the toolkit at his hip. It wasn't a weapon. They didn't have weapons. Not really, but he held it like one. Stay close, Elara said. She took point, moving toward the structure Miri had detected. It was visible now, rising above the trees about half a kilometer away. A tower, black stone, smooth and seamless, like it had been grown rather than built. Miri walked beside her, slate in hand, scanning constantly. The energy signatures are getting stronger. Whatever's in that tower, it's active. Alive. I don't know. Maybe. Darien brought up the rear, his eyes darting to the shadows between the trees. He kept swallowing, a nervous habit Elara had noticed during the briefing. She didn't blame him. This place felt like a dream. Or a nightmare. It was hard to tell the difference. They reached the base of the tower. Up close, the black stone wasn't smooth at all. It was covered in fine lines, carvings, maybe, or script. Miri leaned in, her breath fogging the surface. This is writing, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's the same language from the distress call, but older. Much older. Can you read it? Not yet. But I think, she trailed off, frowning. I think it's a warning. Or a history. Something about a war. A great silence. And then wait. She stepped back. Her face had gone pale. What? Elara asked. The phrase. Not alone. It's here. Carved into the stone. But it's not a message of hope. It's a threat. Like, you're not alone. Something is watching. Something is always watching. The silence of the forest pressed in around them. Elara felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. And then the tower opened. No sound. No grinding of stone or hiss of hydraulics. One moment the wall was solid. The next, a doorway stood there, leading into darkness. Leo took a step back. Darien reached for Alara's arm, then stopped himself. Miri stared into the darkness, her slate held out like a shield. The energy signatures are coming from inside, and the life signs, they're in there too. Thousands of them, but they're not moving. Alara took a breath. She thought about the Admiral, about the hills of Earth, about the crack in the ceiling of her cryopod. I'll go first, she said. Miri with me. Leo and Darien stay here. Keep the comms open. If you hear anything wrong, you leave. You don't wait for us. You go. Captain, Leo started. That's an order. She stepped into the darkness. The inside of the tower was not dark. Not once Alara's eyes adjusted. The walls glowed with a faint phosphorescent light, blue-green, like deep ocean water. The carvings continued here, covering every surface in intricate spirals and sharp angles. The air was warm and still, smelling of ozone and something else. Something sweet, like honey left out too long. Miri walked beside her, her footsteps echoing softly. The slate in her hands was flickering, struggling to process the sheer volume of data. Captain, she said quietly, there are life signs all around us. In the walls, in the floor. But they're not human. They're not even animal. They're something else. Something that exists in a different state. Different how? I don't have the words. It's like they're sleeping, but their dreams are real. Does that make sense? It didn't, but Alara nodded anyway. The corridor sloped downward, leading them deeper into the earth. The blue-green light grew brighter. The sweet smell grew stronger. And then, without warning, the corridor opened into a vast chamber. Alara stopped. The chamber was enormous, easily a kilometer across. The ceiling arched high above, lost in shadow, and covering every surface, walls, floor, even the ceiling, were pods. Thousands of them. Each pod was made of the same black stone as the tower, but translucent, like smoked glass. And inside each pod was a shape. Humanoid, but not human. They were tall, 7, maybe 8 feet. Their limbs were long and slender, ending in hands with too many fingers. Their faces were smooth, featureless. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a curve of bone-white skin that seemed to absorb the light. But they were breathing. Alara could see it. The faint rise and fall of their chests. The occasional twitch of a hand. The Formicide, Miri whispered. The ant people. They didn't vanish. They went to sleep. Alara walked forward slowly, her boots silent on the stone floor. She stopped in front of the nearest pod. Inside, the creature's chest rose. Fell. Rose. Fell. Why, she asked. Why would an entire species put themselves to sleep? Miri was already scanning, her face intense. I'm picking up residual energy traces. Weapon signatures. Very old, but powerful. There was a war. A bad one. They were losing. So they hid. They went into a kind of stasis, waiting for the threat to pass. What threat? I don't know. The records are fragmented. But whatever it was, it's not here anymore. The last energy signature from an external source is dated 150 years ago. Whatever was hunting them is gone. Alara looked around the chamber. Thousands of sleeping aliens, waiting for a threat that had already left, waiting for someone to wake them up. And then she saw the platform. It was in the center of the chamber, raised about 3 meters above the floor. A circular disc of the same black stone. And on the disc, lying on their backs, were 2 figures. Human figures. Alara's heart stopped. She ran. Across the chamber, past the rows of sleeping aliens, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Miri shouted something behind her, but she didn't hear it. She climbed the platform on hands and knees, her palms scraping against the stone. The 2 figures were wearing old-style Commonwealth exploration suits. The patches on their shoulders marked them as crew of the Odysseus, a deep space vessel that had gone missing 230 years ago. Everyone had assumed they were dead. Everyone had been wrong. The first figure was a woman, middle-aged. Her face was peaceful, her eyes closed. Her suit was intact, but the life support display was dark. Dead. The second figure was a man, younger. His face was gaunt, his lips cracked. His eyes were closed too, but his chest was moving. Barely. Just barely. Miri, Alara shouted. Medical kit. Now. Miri was there in seconds, her hands shaking as she pulled the kit from her belt. She pressed a scanner to the man's neck. He's alive. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, hypothermia. But alive. How is that possible? He's been here for 200 years, Alara said. I know. She looked at the pods, at the sleeping aliens, at the woman in the old exploration suit, dead, but perfectly preserved. And then she understood. They kept him alive, she said slowly. The Formicide. They put themselves to sleep, but they kept him awake. Or partly awake. For 2 centuries. What? Miri was already working on the man, injecting fluids, checking his vitals. Maybe they needed him. Maybe he was important. Or maybe they were just lonely. The man's eyes fluttered. Alara leaned close. Can you hear me? What's your name? His lips moved. No sound came out. Then, with enormous effort, he whispered one word. Run. The tower shook. Not a tremor. Not an earthquake. A pulse. A wave of energy that originated somewhere deep below them and radiated outward, making the walls hum and the sleeping aliens twitch in their pods. Alara grabbed the edge of the platform to steady herself. Miri threw an arm over the man's body to keep him from rolling off. What was that? Miri shouted. The comm in Alara's ear crackled. Leo's voice strained. Captain, we've got a problem. The energy signatures you're tracking? They're not just in the tower. They're everywhere. Under the ground. In the trees. The whole planet is. It's waking up. Another pulse. Stronger this time. The floor cracked beneath Alara's feet. The man on the platform opened his eyes fully. They were dark, bloodshot, but lucid. He grabbed Alara's wrist with surprising strength. Not the tower, he gasped. Under. Go under. The warning. The carvings. You have to see the rest. There's more. Miri asked. The tower is just the entrance. The real record is below. The war. The enemy. Why we came here. He coughed a wet, terrible sound. We thought we were saving them. We were wrong. We were so wrong. Another pulse. The sleeping aliens began to stir. Not waking, not yet, but moving. Their 2 long fingers twitched. Their featureless faces turned toward the platform. Alara made a decision. Miri, get him to the surface. Darien, prep the ship for emergency launch. Leo, find me a way down. There has to be a lower level. Captain, that's a bad idea, Leo said. I know. Do it anyway. Miri hesitated, her eyes meeting Alara's. There was fear there, but also something else. Respect. Or maybe just resignation. Don't take too long, Miri said. And then she hoisted the man over her shoulder. He was lighter than he should have been, and headed back toward the surface. Alara turned and ran deeper into the tower. The way down was hidden behind a false wall, just as the man had said. A narrow staircase, spiraling into darkness. The blue-green light faded as she descended, replaced by a deeper, older glow. Red. Like embers. The stairs ended in a chamber smaller than the one above, but no less strange. The walls here were not carved. They were covered in images, not writing, but pictures. A record. A history told in light and shadow. Alara walked slowly around the chamber, her hand brushing the walls. The images moved as she touched them, responding to her presence. She saw ships. Thousands of them. Not Commonwealth ships. Not Formicide ships. Something else. Something vast and dark and hungry. She saw war. A war between the Formicide and this other species, a species that didn't build, didn't speak, didn't negotiate. It only consumed. Planets. Stars. Entire systems. She saw the Formicide losing. Retreating. Running. And then she saw the choice. One of the images showed a group of Formicide, leaders, maybe, or elders, standing around a glowing object. A sphere. No, not a sphere. A seed. A weapon. A last resort. They planted the seed in the heart of their final world. This world. And they went to sleep, waiting for the seed to grow. The next image made Alara's blood run cold. The seed had grown. Not into a weapon. Into a lure. A beacon that mimicked the energy signature of a living world. A rich world. A world full of prey. And the hungry species, the consumers, the images called them, had taken a bait. They had come. They had fed. And they had been destroyed. The seed was not a bomb. It was a trap. A biological weapon that infected the consumers, turned their own hunger against them, made them consume themselves until nothing was left. But the trap had a cost. The seed needed a key, a living intelligence to activate it. The Formicide had planned to use one of their own. But they had been too weak, too diminished by the war. They had gone into stasis, hoping that someday someone would come. Someone like the crew of the Odysseus. Alara stared at the final image. It showed a human hand reaching out to touch the seed, and behind the human, the shadow of the consumers, already gone, already defeated. But the text below the image, the word she could suddenly read as if the tower was translating directly into her mind, said something different. The key becomes the lock. The savior becomes the cage. To wake us is to trap yourself. To save us is to stay forever. Alara backed away from the wall. The seed. The trap. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a prison. Whoever activated it would be bound to this world, their consciousness linked to the stasis field that kept the Formicide asleep. They would be awake, aware, but unable to leave. Unable to die. For centuries. For millennia. Until someone else came to take their place. The man from the Odysseus had been the key. He had activated the trap, destroyed the consumers, saved the Formicide. And then he had been trapped here, kept alive by the tower's systems, waiting for a rescue that would never come. But he hadn't been alone. The woman beside him, she had been his replacement. She had volunteered, or been forced to take his place. But she had died. Something had gone wrong. And now the trap was open. Unstable. And Alara was standing in the middle of it. The chamber shook. The red light flared. And a voice, not Sour's, not Miri's, not any voice you recognized, spoke directly into her mind. The key is broken. The lock is failing. You must choose. Wake the sleepers and become the new key, or leave them to die and let the consumers return. Alara closed her eyes. She thought about the green hills of Earth, the rain on her face, her mother's hug at the spaceport. She thought about her crew, Leo with his quick hands and slower smile, Miri, who had refused to let a species die for profit, Darien, who had broken the law to save his sister. She thought about the name of her ship, the last left turn, and she smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had run out of right turned a long time ago. No, she said aloud. I don't choose either. The voice was silent. Alara opened her eyes and looked at the walls, at the images, at the history of a species that had made the same mistake humans had made 1,000 times. They had tried to fight an enemy by becoming like it. You didn't need a weapon, she said. You needed a mirror, something to show the consumers what they really were. But you built a cage instead, and then you asked someone else to climb inside. She walked to the center of the chamber, where the floor glowed brightest red. Beneath her feet, she could feel the seed, waiting, hungry. I'm not going to be your key, she said, and I'm not going to let your people die. There's a third option. The voice returned, confused now. There is no third option. There's always a third option, Alara said. You just have to be stubborn enough to find it. She pulled out her comm Leo. How fast can you reroute the ship's distortion drive through the tower's power grid? A pause. Then, fast enough to kill us all. Why? Because I need a pulse. A big one. Not a weapon, a signal. Something that will wake up every Formicide on this planet at the same time. Captain, that's insane. The energy requirements alone. Can you do it or not? Another pause. Longer this time. When Leo spoke again, his voice was different. Calmer. Almost peaceful. Yeah, I can do it. But you're going to have to be in the tower when it happens. The pulse will go through you. It'll hurt. I know, and it might kill you. I know that too. Silence on the comm then, softly. See you on the other side, Captain. Alara tucked the comm away and sat down cross-legged on the glowing floor. She placed her hands on her knees, palms up. Close her eyes. The voice in her mind was frantic now. What are you doing? You cannot wake them all at once. The shock would destroy their minds. They will be lost. No, Alara said. They won't. Because I'm not going to wake them with force. I'm going to wake them with a question. A question. The distress call. Not alone. That's what you wanted them to hear, wasn't it? That's what the Odysseus crew tried to tell you. You're not alone. There are other species in the galaxy. Other minds. Other ways of thinking. She opened her eyes. The red light was brighter now, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. So here's my question, she said. Do you want to sleep forever, hiding from a ghost? Or do you want to wake up and meet your neighbors? The voice was silent for a long time. Then, softly, like a door opening, we are afraid. I know, Alara said. Me too. But fear isn't a reason to stay asleep. It's a reason to find someone to hold your hand. She held out her hand, palm up, open, and waited. The pulse did not hurt. That was the first surprise. Alara had braced for agony, for her nerves to light on fire, for her mind to be torn apart by the raw energy of the seed. But instead there was warmth, a spreading, golden warmth that started in her chest and moved outward through her arms, her legs, her fingertips. She heard Leo's voice over the comm, distant now, like an echo. Pulse initiated. Energy transfer stable. Captain, your vitals are weird. Your brain activity is off the charts. I feel fine, she said. And she meant it. The voice in her mind had changed. It was no longer a single voice. It was thousands, millions all speaking at once, but not in words. In feelings. In images. In a shared memory of a species that had been asleep for 10,000 years. They were afraid. They were confused. They were waking up, and the world was different than they remembered. But they were not alone. Alara opened her eyes. The chamber was no longer red. It was golden, bathed in the light of the pulse. The walls were shifting, the images changing, rewriting themselves in real time. New history, new choices. She stood up. Her legs were steady. Her heart was calm. Miri, she said into the comm, status on the surface? Miri's voice was breathless. Captain, the pods, they're opening. All of them. The Formicidae are waking up. They're just standing there, looking around. They're not attacking. They're not doing anything. They're just waiting. Waiting for what? I think they're waiting for you. Alara walked back up the spiral staircase, through the corridor, into the great chamber with its thousands of empty pods. The aliens were standing now, their two long limbs unfolded, their featureless faces turned toward her. They didn't speak. They didn't move. But she could feel them, a vast, silent chorus of minds, all asking the same question. What now? She walked among them, slowly, her boots echoing on the stone floor. They parted to let her pass, their bodies casting long shadows in the golden light. She reached the platform. The man from the Odysseus was gone. Miri must have taken him to the ship. But the woman was still there, her dead eyes closed, her face peaceful. Alara looked at the sleeping Formicidae, at the waking ones, at the tower that had been a prison and was now, maybe, something else. Now, she said, loud enough for all of them to hear, we talk. The negotiation took 3 days. Not because the Formicidae were difficult. They were, in fact, remarkably reasonable once they got over the initial shock of being awake. But because they had no concept of language as humans understood it. They communicated in emotional resonances, in shared memories, in images that could mean a dozen different things depending on the context. Miri was invaluable. She worked around the clock, her slate covered in notes, her voice hoarse from hours of speaking aloud what she was translating in her head. The Formicidae didn't have names for themselves, so she called them the sleepers. They didn't have a word for future, so she drew pictures of children playing under a yellow sun. Darien kept the ship running, repairing the distortion drive with parts scavenged from the tower. Leo helped him, grumbling about alien technology and the lack of proper coffee. But Alara caught him once, standing at the edge of the forest, watching a group of sleepers touch the silver-leaved trees with their 2 long fingers. His expression wasn't fear. It was wonder. On the second night, Alara sat alone at the base of the tower, looking up at the stars. The yellow sun had set, and the sky was full of unfamiliar constellations. No Big Dipper, no Orion, just a spray of light that could have been anywhere. The man from the Odysseus, his name was Thomas Armitage, sat down beside her. He was weak, still recovering, but his eyes were clear. You're not going to leave, he said. It wasn't a question. Alara didn't answer immediately. She picked up a small stone from the ground, turned it over in her fingers. The distortion drive is almost fixed. We could leave tomorrow, but you won't. She looked at him. In the starlight, his face was older than his years. He had spent 2 centuries and a half life, trapped between waking and sleeping, holding the line against a threat that had already been defeated. He had given everything, and no one had even known his name. They need someone to teach them, Alara said. How to talk, how to trade, how to be part of a galaxy that's moved on without them. They need a bridge. And you're volunteering to be that bridge? She smiled. It was a small smile, tired but real. Someone has to. And I'm already here. Thomas was quiet for a long time. Then he reached out and took the stone from her hand. He turned it over, looked at it, and set it back on the ground. The Odysseus had a poet, he said. She used to say that home wasn't a place. It was the people who knew your name. Do you know my name? Ven, captain of the last left turn. The woman who woke up a sleeping species because she was too stubborn to take the easy way out. She laughed. It was a rusty sound, unpracticed, but it felt good. Yeah, she said. That's me. On the third day, Alara called her crew together in the mess hall. The coffee machine was working again. Leo had finally bullied it into submission, and the smell of it filled the small space like a benediction. I'm staying, she said. No priambid. No softening. The sleepers need a liaison. Someone who understands both worlds. I'm volunteering. Darien was the first to react. He set down his cup and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Anger, maybe, or grief. You can't, he said. You're the captain. The mission was to find the source of the signal and determine if it posed a threat. The signal was a cry for help. The threat is gone. And the only danger here is leaving a species to figure out the galaxy on their own after 10,000 years of isolation. Miri was quiet, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. The Commonwealth won't see it that way. They'll call it desertion. The Commonwealth can call it whatever they want. I'm not doing this for them. Leo leaned back in his seat, his arms crossed. So what happens to us? We just go home and tell the admirals you decided to play ambassador. You go home and tell them the truth. The Formicide are awake. They're peaceful. They want to talk. And if the Commonwealth is smart, they'll send diplomats. Real ones, not scouts on a suicide mission. And if they're not smart? Darien asked. Alara shrugged. Then, I'll be here, making sure the sleepers know that not all humans are like the ones in charge. Silence filled the mess hall. Outside, the yellow sun was rising, casting long shadows across the clearing. Miri stood up first. She walked around the table and stood in front of Alara. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then, she reached out and took Alara's hands in hers. You're a fool, Miri said. But you're the bravest fool I've ever known. She squeezed Alara's hands once, then let go. Leo came next. He didn't say anything. He just nodded once and clapped her on the shoulder. His hand lingered for a moment, then fell. Darien was the last. He stood up slowly, his jaw tight. He looked like he wanted to argue, to insist, to find a way to make her change her mind. But he didn't. He just looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her chest ache. Respect. You taught me something, he said quietly. Out here. You taught me that doing the right thing doesn't mean you have to be a hero. Sometimes it just means being the one who stays. He held out his hand. She shook it, and then he was gone, following Miri and Leo toward the ship. The last left turn lifted off an hour later. Alara stood at the base of the tower, watching it rise. The distortion drive hummed, a sound she'd learned to hate and then, somehow, to love. The ship grew smaller and smaller until it was just a speck against the yellow sun. Then it was gone. She stood there for a long time, alone in the clearing. The sleepers were behind her, waiting. Thousands of them, silent and patient, their featureless faces turned toward the sky. Thomas Armitage limped up beside her. He was leaning on a staff he'd carved from one of the silver-leaved trees. You okay? He asked. Alara took a breath. The air was sweet and clean, untouched by the smoke and steel of human industry. The forest rustled in a wind that carried no voices but her own. No, she said, but I will be. She turned away from the sky and walked back toward the tower, toward the sleepers, toward a future she hadn't chosen but would fight for anyway. Behind her, the yellow sun climbed higher, and somewhere in the darkness between stars, the Commonwealth would receive a message, a report, a final transmission from the last left turn. It would say, simply, found them. They're scared. They're beautiful. They're not alone anymore. Neither am I. Alara Ven, captain of no ship and ambassador to no government, walked into the tower and began the work of building a bridge. It was, she thought, the first right turn she'd made in years.